Welcome to Innovation in Government from WEST 2026 in San Diego, presented by Carasoft. I'm FedGov Today's Francis Rose. Today, you'll meet leaders from across the Navy, Marine Corps, and the Defense Industrial Base who say they're focused on one central mission: delivering capability to the warfighter faster, smarter, and with greater confidence. You'll learn how leaders are connecting sensors to shooters at machine speed, how the Marine Corps is embedding force design into everyday operations, and how the Navy's transforming combat training to ensure sailors are ready on day one. Let's get started. Admiral Zerr, it's great to have you here. Thanks for joining me today. You called the Surface Warfare Combat Training Continuum SWCTIC. What's the mission of SWCTIC? What's the purpose of SWCTIC?
Thanks, Francis. It's great to be here on FedGov with you. SWCTIC is a realization that our warfighters on surface ships have to be ready on day one. To take a quick step back in the CNO's lexicon, we're central to the foundry, but we connect with the fleet and to the fight. And so how do we do that? We set up the scenario where the combat watchstanders get the reps and sets that they need to be ready on day one. We certainly have learned a great deal in the Red Sea and in the 12-day war. There are things that are unforced errors. There are things that we could train to better. What we know is in the most pressing warfighting scenarios we could find ourselves in, we have to be ready on the very first salvo. And so what Surface Warfare Combat Training Continuum does, SWCTIC, is it sets up the qualifications and the experiences we want. So think schools, think big training events throughout your career. Then it sets the training and readiness matrix, which is the reps and sets. In the surface force, we have historically, once you get certified, only tracked watch team training after that. That doesn't mean that every watchstander on that ship is actually getting the reps and sets across all the warfare areas. So what the training and readiness matrix does is it says, in surface warfare, you need to do these activities every 90, 180 days. ASW, anti-submarine warfare, air defense, that these are the things you have to do to not just stay qualified, but to be proficient. Again, the objective is to get back to the point where we have high confidence that that watch team, when assembled, when they face a very challenging incoming threat, are ready to do exactly what they need to on the first moment of crisis. The last thing is the maritime warfare proficiency model. The idea here is that when we understand what everybody's experiences and training are, what their level of proficiency is with reps and sets, and then we add in other things like skill sets, background in education, aptitude, that we get an understanding of what each individual needs to get to the standard. The idea that we just say everybody at this level needs 15 of X, it doesn't actually represent the variation we see person to person in their skill sets and experience. And I think we can use our training scenarios, our simulators, in a better way to get everyone to the standard so they're just ready to fight when that moment comes. The last piece I would say to you is that I think in surface warfare, there's a growing understanding on the tactical side that there's a desire to be a master at this. And what the SWCTIC program allows for is somebody to progress through from very rudimentary starting point to very complex best in the Navy kind of skill sets where they can achieve that. And then as a force, we see that on each ship, how many we have of each type. And we can even adjust those if we ever found ourselves in a moment where we wanted to plus up a ship.
Before we turn the cameras on, you talked about the fact that data is really important to the work that you're doing here. It's not surprising given how data-centric the Navy and all the services have become. How is data important to what you're doing with SWCTIC?
Francis, great question. Two types of data. I would say data on training and readiness, and then there's data for warfighting. First one on the training and readiness. Under SWCTIC, we are leveraging contractors and tools we already have that will display the data of where a ship is and where an individual is. When it was all spreadsheets and emails, or worse yet, when it was just a notepad, it's very tough to keep track, but then display it across a whole force where you have 20 or 30 watchstanders, and then you have all the ships across all those ships. Now it's the computers do this for us, and it really is a warfighting advantage to know what that ship would need to get all the way to the standard, even as they're maybe transiting to an area of crisis. The other piece is actual combat systems data. What we've done in the Red Sea and in the 12-day war is we've taken data from our ships that was intended for long changes to combat systems, months, years kind of work. We have figured out how to get that information off in minutes, get it back to a group of my WTIs, so warfare tactics instructors, the contractors, and our warfare development centers. These groups that have come together of experts, where in minutes sometimes, or certainly within hours, we go back out to the ship and say, hey, maybe this is a setup recommendation for you. Or in other cases, we've actually pushed out changes to the software that the combat system uses to be better against the threats we're facing. So data is essential now for us to learn at speed and be successful. The difference, of course, is that we've been in a fight. The fight will be very different. And so our thoughts on data on the combat system side is not limited to what we've seen. It is to take what we've learned there and think in our minds, what would it take in a much more complex, much more high threat, and much more high tempo environment? That's what we're creating to actually process that data should we find ourselves in that fight.
We just have a couple of minutes left, Admiral. One of the things that struck me about SWCTIC is historically, training in the military has taken a tactical to strategic, short-term to long-term look. You're thinking about a surface warfare officer's career as a whole, and then it looks like bringing it back to the individual assignment that that person has at that moment. Am I looking at it the right way?
You have it right, Francis. The idea is, and having been commanding officer of a DDG, by the time you get there, you know everything. And when you're a division officer and you look up, you sort of think that guy or gal knows everything.
Yeah.
The truth is when you're in the seat, you realize there's all sorts of things you need your team to buffer you, or things that you were just never exposed to. SWCTIC is to start from the beginning in these qualifications and experiences so that we actually know that when somebody gets to be XO or CO of a ship, hey, just because of their timing, their experience, they didn't do this thing. Let's go give them some training reps and sets so that they're more complete, and maybe even look at their team and say, hey, if that's a gap for them, how do I have a lieutenant or lieutenant commander that's extraordinarily strong, or executive officer for that commanding officer? We're going to learn a ton about how to make that combat team. What I don't want anybody to think is that the individual focus that SWCTIC has, it is because when we get the individuals to a higher level, the watch team can perform at a much higher level. The watch team is always the end point for warfighting on a ship. It's not the individual. It is how those individuals come in and make that team operate at the highest possible speed correctly by our TTP.
Chad Kiefer's head of U.S. Federal for Infoblox Federal. It's great to see you, Chad. Thanks for coming today. Interoperability seems to be one of the most popular points of discussion here. What are the keys that you're seeing to reaching the interoperability goals that the Navy, Marine Corps, the Sea Services have?
Yeah, I think first we have to give some recognition to the industry and our mil deps for the progress that they have made over the last decade, but we still have gaps, right? I mean, we have pockets of excellence, right? You have these vertical platforms that operate independently. They don't often talk to everybody. You have operators operating on a thicket of guidance. You have the DoD setting standards, NIST setting standards, OMB releasing guidance, and all the executive orders, right? Directionally, they're aligned, but they oftentimes can fall flat for the people who have to put them into practice. And I think lastly, some of the things we see in our mission partner environments, like they operate off a different tech baseline. And so that becomes a very different set of problems to deal with.
What are you seeing the organizations that you're working with doing to try to address some of those issues? And what's industry's role in helping to put out some of those fires?
Yeah, that's a great question. We oftentimes see the government look to industry for guidance, and we as an industry look to the government for requirements, right? So there's a fundamental problem there, sometimes in the way that we interact. But some of the things that I've seen is, as an industry, what we can help do is harmonize those things into standards, into practicality. We can also build more horizontal type platforms, like using the data as a control plane, right? Underneath of these vertical silos of like endpoints and firewalls and things that do these things really well, but don't often talk to one another very well. And then lastly, I think repeatability, right? We don't often all the time want the government to rip and replace. We want to allow them to have efficiency and to maximize the ROI with the tools that they have.
How has the proliferation of data and the way that data has to move from application to application, from thing to thing, all across the department, changed the way that people like you look at connecting those dots together?
Well, I think the data is the important piece, and oftentimes the siloed environments between the NetOps and the SecOps and now the cloud folks, they don't often look at the same picture, right? So that is a problem. And like I said, when we look at how do you harmonize that data into a horizontal type platform so that everybody can, have a baseline and operate, like that's what it is that we focus on. We want there to be facts, right? And we want to operate off of those facts.
A lot of leaders that I've talked to here and in the last, I'd say 6 months to a year inside the department have talked about a willingness to, we want to buy off the shelf or we want to use commercial solutions, executive orders to that effect, orders from the top of the department to do that. Are you starting to see that trickle down where people are coming to you and saying, what do you have that I can use now? Or what is happening in sectors outside of the federal government, financial services sector and so on, that we can learn from or that we can use those same types of solutions?
I think the spirit is there. You always have organizations in different departments that like we're different, right? So we want to use off the shelf, but we oftentimes have to customize it, or we have to, some sort of flavorize it to their environment. I think what we try to do is we try to make it a little more open, right, as a platform and API, so that we can operate that way. But again, as industry, we're going to offer the best practices that we see that'll deliver you the results that you want to get.
Yeah. Is there a role for industry to kind of help the organizations that have the same mindset that you just described? Yeah, you are special and unique, but this will still work for you and you don't have to do a lot of customization and you can get to implementation faster?
Yeah, I think if you're talking to a fast mover in the organization where they want to get stuff done and they've seen the red tape that they have to go through, like, of course, yes, we can. But it's still pretty difficult to get through. Well, it's the red tape or it's the requirements and we have to check this box first. And then again, like you have agencies, well, I don't want to share my data, right? I don't want, phone home, and I don't want to report to Big Brother. So there's still some challenges.
What are you going to track over the next 6 months to a year as these modernization efforts continue across the department?
Clearly zero trust. And then I think from a platform perspective, like I said, you have these vertical silos, great tools, great technology. They don't oftentimes talk to one another effectively. And so what we want to build is something that operates off a common picture that really helps the agency drive the mission forward.
Stretch Myers, Field Federal CTO for Axonius Federal Systems. Welcome, Stretch. Great to see you. What are the most important components to helping the Navy and Marine Corps hit their modernization transformation goals?
Yeah, so I've been getting that question a lot, not just the Navy, but the DoD as a whole. My whole background is actually working as a cyber engineer architecture in the DoD space. So I've been hands-on network on all of the networks for a very long time. And one of the things for transformation is, you have everyone focusing on AI and all these big buzzwords, but we're still struggling with the basics. How are we going to have all these cybersecurity involvement or enhancements when we still can't answer the question of like, where's our devices? What's the posture of our devices? And so I think for some of the transformation, when we can start focusing on getting back to the basics, then we can start moving forward with all the fun stuff. Let's do the AI, let's do the machine learning, let's get back to looking at SOARs again. Those were really hot, years ago. Now they're kind of circling back around with AI, trying to make them easier. So that's some of the things that I'm really looking forward to for the transformation of helping with that. Because when we can help with something that sounds simple, that isn't so simple, then we can start to take the hard things, make them easy, and then start tackling the real hard things like AI and how can we be more productive with it within the environment.
It's an interesting observation because I'm not surprised by all the discussion here about the advanced technologies that you just described.
Right.
What I am surprised by is the tremendous amount of discussion here about infrastructure.
Right.
And the kind of the fundamentals
right.
of delivering these capabilities.
Yeah, I spend most of my time doing the CTO stuff, talking to executive leadership. Every time I start describing, like, say, just our capability, for an example, they're like, oh, well, we already have that technology. We do that. And most of my time is education. No, you're paying a team of FTEs to hand make that that you think is automation, when it's really a bunch of people behind the scenes automating that for you and whatever their visualization platform is. And so once they spend the time and look at the total cost of ownership and realize they could really get some true correlation to see the attack surface and the gaps in the environment, and then how it can really lead to bigger platforms and bigger AI initiatives, that's probably half my battle. And then once we demonstrate it, and then they get their engineerings to validate it, it goes a long way.
Mm-hmm. Do you see more of a willingness to accept commercial technologies, things that already exist, than you have in the past?
Yeah, there's a lot of push coming from executive orders now to move more towards commercial off-the-shelf tools versus government off-the-shelf tools. You still have people that have built their career on that, and they're having a hard time letting go. I've seen some folks do it better than others, where they're just adopting the commercial off-the-shelf tools and involving their babies, where others are just having a really hard time letting go. But you're starting to see come out of Congress and everything else where they're pushing the government. So you need to go more commercial off the shelf because it's supported. Where, a lot of these government off the shelf tools are using open source, the amount of FTEs, the security vulnerabilities, the development life cycle, it's just very involved. And a lot of time that gets masked behind large contracts that are probably 3 times the cost of an enterprise approach of a commercial based vendor product.
If we take that one step further, then, are there lessons learned or actual sectors in the private sector that an enterprise like the Pentagon can look at and say, well, they don't do the same thing we do, but they do similar things to what we do, and we can learn from them about how to solve the problems that we need to solve?
Yeah, a prime example of some of my meetings this morning. We have a lot of, so the whole reason I'm out here is we have a lot of activity going with big Navy, big Marines across the board. And it's so much activity. Anyone that knows the Navy, it's one big Navy that's very compartmentalized. They got so many of the different PEOs working in synergy, but doing their different things and talking. One of the things I have a fun time with is starting to bring all the different customers we're working with together and let them talk to each other. They're aware of each other, but they aren't aware they're doing some of the same initiatives together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really great when we overlap those meetings on purpose.
Yeah.
And tell them we're going to bring them in and introduce them, and they start exchanging notes of like, well, we're doing this, we're doing that. And then it just builds new working groups. We did similar type things in other parts of the Fed civilian government, where we introduced so many government folks together because they were doing similar missions that they developed working groups to keep talking. And anytime I can make that happen and connect the dots, it's no different than when I was on network supporting. And so it's just a lot of fun to get people to talk to each other that have a common mission.
Kevin Hansen, CTO of MFGS. Great to see you again. Thanks for joining me. What are the most effective strategies to employ for the Navy and Marine Corps as they're trying to meet digitization, modernization goals?
Yeah, the one we like to leverage with our Navy customers comes from the open standards group, opengroup.org, called IT for IT. And it's really about driving more compliance, more velocity, and more quality into software delivery. So whether we're talking IT or OT or cyber, it's about getting the right infrastructure in place. And then, of course, what really empowers that strategy to move forward with speed is being data driven. Again, whether it's IT, OT, or even cyber, the more fidelity you're adding in this era of AI is going to drive more quality into your applications, so that you can then, whether you're a sailor looking at a console, making sure that a particular server is still up and running, not have any problems, or whether you're a cyber warrior trying to find that latest threat out on a ship somewhere, having the fidelity of the data, and then having the AI to help drive the correlation of that data so that you're focused on really critical stuff, is really kind of foundational to that IT for IT framework.
I'm struck by the mention of infrastructure right up front. I'm glad you said that. And the reason is because I continue to talk to folks in the sea services and other parts of the department who are still focused on that. And part of me thinks, well, it's 2026. Why are we still talking about infrastructure? And yet, when you mentioned artificial intelligence, and there are all these things that are new types of technologies that may or may not rely on a different type of infrastructure than before. Am I looking at that the wrong way?
No, not at all. I mean, I think you have to start with what you have. And then, of course, as new innovation and technology comes out, you're looking to improve your mission in different ways. You want to leverage some of that technology. But having this foundational reference architecture that you can measure that implementation against, gives you the metrics, gives you the data to help drive priorities to drive those new innovations into the architecture, or perhaps identify that they're not ready yet. And you're better served, maybe invest in some of the existing capabilities that you already have.
What are some of the gaps that you still see in infrastructure when you go and look at organizations, what they've got?
A lot of it is still getting the right data to the right people at the right time. So, silos still exist, and in a lot of cases, there's good reasons for that. But we really need more connected systems to get the fidelity of the data that we need to help drive some of the better decisions and better quality that we're going after.
Are there variables in building data infrastructure, the type of data that's moving across that infrastructure, the mission of the organization, other things I didn't mention? Or is data infrastructure pretty much data infrastructure?
Data infrastructure is pretty much data infrastructure, except, you need governance to help kind of manage the different formats, the different ways to access that data. So it matters to a degree, but we're getting closer to the point where applications are able to talk to each other without standardizing their data formats. So I think things will get easier and better when it comes to sharing information, especially data formats that aren't very accessible. But we're getting there.
Is that happening because, why is that happening, I guess, is the better question.
Man, you think about all the different types of technology that the Navy employs, whether it's weapon systems, whether it's OT-based systems, navigational systems, IT systems, and cyber systems. You bring a lot of different technology to bear that operates with different types and different formats of data. And so it's been a challenge to share information given those constraints. But again, this is an area that AI is going to help. It's going to help normalize those unusual formats and make them readable, again, by the people who need to see that data when they need to see it.
Colonel Kenneth Jones is Director of Science and Technology at the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab. Colonel, welcome. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
We were talking a little bit before we turned the cameras on about one of your priorities is getting data from sensor to shooter. How are you getting after that, and how are you looking to industry to help you get after that?
It sounds like a simple process. Just taking as simple as things are these days, the internet, you're tapping a server across the world, probably, maybe, and you're bringing it to your computer screen. So it sounds very simple, but we're talking about a multitude of systems of various form factors, whether it's an aircraft, a ground, a satellite, a node that someone has far forward. It's very difficult to bring all that data together, to collate that. And one of the hardest things for the longest time was getting organizations to work together. The longest time, they just wanted you to buy the whole sensor to shooter package from them. They wanted to sell you the bird. They wanted to sell you the missile. They wanted to sell you the truck. They wanted to sell you the software and the laptop. That's not the case anymore. And I think industry is understanding that they have to go towards open architecture. And so the challenge now is getting these different companies, software applications, platforms. What we try to communicate to them is you have to be able to work with your competitor. You have to have your data be able to share with someone else's data, not just within the Marine Corps, but across the joint force. That's awesome if I'm able to utilize Marine Corps data from Marine Corps sensors, but you're not getting the richness of the data if you're not tapping into whether it's national technical means, other services, other agencies. I want as much data as I can. I want to bring that together, collate it, fuse the data, and then be able to get that to a shooter to prosecute a target.
Mm-hmm. The sensor to shooter dialogue is interesting to me too, because I imagine there's a threshold at some point where the shooter has more information than that person can use. So I imagine there's an element of getting the right information from sensor to shooter. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, and you can certainly have information overload, and that's why we just want to have a singular application of some sort. Now, one of the biggest challenges with what you just described is that there are going to be multiple applications. I think some think there's one application to rule them all. As soon as you start to introduce a new one, they go, well, I like my application. Well, the function of that application is probably different from this one. We have to figure out, how do we connect all those? When do I need this application? At what echelon do in that application? And then where does that data need to go? At a higher echelon of command, at a combatant command. For us, the MEF is the highest level, all the way down to company and battalion. And the challenge also is the bandwidth. I don't have great bandwidth down at that lower level. If I'm sitting in a large headquarters, or if I'm sitting in a structure, maybe somewhere in a large city, that's where the combatant command is, then maybe I have unlimited pipes. I can bring in large amounts of data. I need to be able to get that data down to a unit that doesn't have that amount of bandwidth, maybe doesn't have the processing power. So there's all kinds of challenges. It's very complex. We have an organization right now called Operation Dynamis. It's not really an organization, it's more of an effort. And they're taking existing platforms, they're taking software from multiple vendors, and they're making sure that I can take that data that I'm talking about from a sensor to this application on this platform, share it maybe laterally to another platform, and then eventually bring it into, as you described earlier on, is how do I make that data simple and then manageable, so that I don't have 6 laptops sitting in front of me,
Right.
and I'm monitoring the COP, the common operating picture here. I'm getting targeting data on these 3 laptops. One of the things we have done is we've taken a laptop, and think about just your iPhone or your iPad. I'm able to tap into different applications on that one device. And so we're doing that with the Marine Corps. We're able to port applications into a laptop with a server. It's a very simple system, but you still have to figure out, as you described, how do I simplify that data? What's the actionable data that, as you described, the user needs to then send to a shooter? And does that pathway work? Are they on the same network? Can I send it out to the shooter, whether it's an aircraft, unmanned, manned system, down to an artillery unit that's rockets, HIMARS, cannon? Can I get that down to them? It's complex, but that's the largest challenge we have right now.
I would propose too that you talked about the importance of getting this information, being able to share not just among Marine Corps personnel, but also Joint Force personnel. Right. So I'm thinking about that in my brain on a horizontal level. Right. And then I'm thinking vertically about allies and partners in an operational environment too. How does that inform the way that you're trying to get after these issues?
So my previous job, I was at 2MEF. We primarily are focused, and they are now focused in the Caribbean, but our previous focus was on EUCOM. And so one of the challenges that we had is, in order to share with our partners and allies, is what we use is called a CDS, a cross-domain solution. How do I get that data from my enclave into their enclave, ensuring I'm not providing data that they can't have access to? So there's a security classification issue. So I need to be able to share that with allies and partners. I have to know what I can and can't share. That's another tall task. And this is all part of this we now refer to as CJAD C2, right? So it's our ability to share data across the Joint Force with allies and partners. And then what data, where's the data coming from? It's all very difficult, but there are things that we're currently working through right now.
And it must be instantaneous too, I imagine.
Because at some point that data becomes bad. That data is no longer useful. We use the very esoteric term of data latency.
Yeah.
So once that that data that I have on the target is no longer targetable, right, it's not useful to me. So absolutely, we talk about target custody, and then when I transfer that to a partner or ally, how long does that process take? You're right. It's probably not instantaneous. There's probably at some point where somebody's gonna look at that data before it gets pushed to the next either echelon or ladder, like we talked about. So there's going to be a man on the loop. Eventually you get to where that data comes, it goes through perhaps some curation in the system, and then it maybe goes to a partner or ally, or goes down to a shooter. When I was an artilleryman, kind of for us, the best thing we could possibly do is have a radar sense a target. And like you described, it went through all the systems down to me on the gun line, and I was able within seconds to put rounds on a mortar position in Iraq. That was amazing. So someday perhaps we get to that point where data goes from an exquisite sensor all the way down to a shooter. It's been curated. Maybe AI has helped to inform it. It's through machine learning, has learned what's good data and bad data, understands what data latency is, and then gets down to a shooter.
Terry Dorsey's evangelist and data architect for Denodo. Terry, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining me today. What are the most effective strategies that the Navy and Marine Corps can employ as they're going on their digitization, modernization journeys?
Yeah, thank you. It's good for me to be here as well, right? So I'm going to start with what I think are, I'm going to start from a challenge perspective, right? So I think when I talk to a lot of agencies or people that are in that space, and I would also say it's pretty much familiar for commercial spaces as well. There's this idea of interoperability, distributed agencies, organizations, what have you. And so there's this idea of how do we actually acquire this way of communicating information out, but keep autonomy across the rest of my organizations, and it's very strongly in the federal space. So what I would say to that, with the advent of things like just specifically generative AI, which is hastening a lot of movement around that. And so to me, there's this idea of centralizing meaning and doing it in such a way that the consumer is agnostic, right? And so this idea of creating abstractions of organizations, be it components, relationships, basically creating the semantics. And I'm going to call it a core, because a lot of people, when they think about semantics, they think about very granular things. I'm going to say a core parts of your organization or enterprise, and governing that and making it available to agnostic consumers. And I think that is pretty much positioning organizations and agencies to take advantage of many modern technologies down the road as well.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that concept applies to commercial organizations as well. Do you get a sense that the department is really putting its money where its mouth is when it says it's interested in knowing what's available in the commercial sector and how it might apply to mission sets inside the building?
I mean, for sure, I would agree, because I mean, typically commercial organizations move fast, the monetary incentives to do so. And so when they move fast, they fail fast, and there's a lot of lessons that are learned. And in some instances, commercial organizations can learn a lot from government organizations, their idea around planning and strategy prior to movement, right? And so if we could marry those two and figure out how to speed up those processes, I think both types of organizations can learn from each other in that regard.
What do you see moving forward as the markers that organizations should use inside the building to determine we're on the right track with this digitization, modernization effort, or we've maybe veered in a direction that we want to try to recalibrate?
You mean as far as measurement?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. Many organizations, particularly in the commercial space, when they do modernization and transformation projects, unfortunately, a lot of times that focus is more on the technology, that maybe, to your point, more so than how it is translated out to business outcomes as to how things move forward. So I think that aligning it with business objectives for what you want outside of that transformation helps greatly in that regard.
Mention generative AI in particular, and a lot of conversation here about artificial intelligence generally. I haven't detected a whole lot of people thinking about Gen AI as kind of a separate or a piece inside the broader artificial intelligence table. What would you encourage DoD organizations to think about regarding Gen AI in particular as they try to move out more on it, seeing efforts like GenAI.mil and so on?
Right. So when it comes to generative AI, and it's interesting, I just had a conversation similar to this with another customer. I think the big takeaway for me that I would say is that it's different than traditional, not in basically how it's, but the models are provided, and it's now what is the data that you're actually working with that model with. Whereas before, you did have to provide data, but it was structured. You understood the inputs and outcomes. So when it comes to generative AI, it's more around how do I package knowledge so that I can drive intent, understand intent, and drive outcomes based off of that. And so I think that understanding the differences in how those technologies work would move things a lot of, you can't do things the way you do with traditional AI. You can't stage a lot of data sets and things like that because you're imagining what's happening prior to some of the inputs that are coming in. So I think it takes a different approach to how you model information and present it out.
Chris Betts is Federal Chief Technology Officer for Omnissa. Chris, welcome. It's great to see you. What are the big challenges that you're seeing organizations wrestling with regarding interoperability across the services? And what types of interoperability are you seeing them trying to deal with?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me, by the way. I think if data is going to be at the tip of the spear, when soldiers or sailors or individuals that are downrange, when they're interpreting that data, it's got to be uniform, it's got to be consistent, and they have to all understand it in the same way. And that's very hard to do when you don't have that interoperability. And I think the other key thing when it comes to interoperability is if you've got a bunch of snowflake architectures or unique architectures that are out there that are ingesting that data differently, they're obviously going to output that data differently. So I think, consolidating platforms where there's overlap and having that unification of platform is key to our soldiers downrange interpreting the data properly.
You hit a word there that is funny to me because I've heard the word architecture here more than I probably have in the last year. And it's interesting to me that that's where so much focus of conversation is when there's a million autonomous vehicles in the room, lots of discussion about artificial intelligence and so on. What do you think is driving that kind of back to the basics movement almost?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those things that you just mentioned rely on an architecture, and that architecture's got to be able to span across an enterprise. And, in this space, when we're talking about, when things need to communicate or operate from land to sea, sea to air, air to space, all of those things, it's very important to have a solid architecture that enables that.
We talked about that a little bit before we turned the cameras on. The fact that there is data going all over the place, all the time, in every direction. And one of the stated goals that all of the services, not just the sea services that are here, have made is to avoid having data have to come back to home base to then go out to another point somewhere on the edge.
Yeah.
What do you see as the most important factors to driving that type of data interoperability so that data can kind of move around the edge instead of that back to base?
Yeah, I think, and we'll talk about AI for a second. So obviously a lot of these systems are evolving around AI. AI, typically you've got a phone back home or consume a cloud resource somewhere to enable that capability. So I think you're going to see a lot of agentic AI that's processing that data locally in real time without having to phone back home at the edge, like you said. So I think it's important for vendors such as Omnissa that when we're accounting and, accounting for how we develop our software, that it has that on-prem SaaS capability that enables the edge.
Mm-hmm. As the desire for the department to do different things changes, what they want to accomplish as far as mission set is different now than it was a year ago, 4 years ago, for sure, 5 years, and so on. As that changes, what's the impact of that on the way that you and your colleagues in the defense industrial base need to build solutions for them that are flexible, that are not just scalable to get more or bigger of something, but to also maybe go in a different direction without having to start completely from scratch to accomplish the same capability?
Yeah, I think as you rationalize tool sets, right? There's some great technologies that have been around for a while and that the field uses today. Why not dive into those and expand upon those? But again, go through and rationalize the tools that you have, get rid of the overlap that exists. And where that helps us is that when we develop our software, it truly allows us to have like a unified architecture or a unified platform to enable doing exactly that.
What will you track in the next 6 months or year, especially regarding interoperability, to see this is what the department is doing, this is how we in the defense industrial base should respond?
Yeah, I think designing platforms that are agnostic to the underlying architecture, so whether it's a hyperscaler or a hypervisor or containers based or what have you, developing a piece of software that works in all of those. Because obviously the Air Force is going to do something different than the Marines, likewise with the Army. But if you develop a piece of software that, regardless of what that core underlying platform or architecture is, you should have software that can integrate with it and run on top of that so that it's consistent regardless of where it's running from.
Chris Boyd's head of U.S. Federal Sales for Zoom. Welcome, Chris. It's good to see you. What's the industry perspective on supporting the digitization, modernization efforts that the sea service, especially Navy and Marine Corps, are talking about here?
Yeah, I think a lot of what we see is a lot of legacy technology where there's a lot of technical debt. Largely what we see are industry, across the industry and really across DOW, are legacy systems, and they're trying to figure out how they get from where they are to where they're trying to go from an innovation perspective. The trick is, how do you do that without making such a heavy investment in the middle so you can continue to innovate? And I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to focus on with Zoom. Historically, we've been seen as a meeting company, and we're moving more into the telephony space and getting around how we can answer TDM problems. So you've got aging telephone systems and telephony systems that are on a lot of post camps and stations, especially around the Marine Corps and Navy, and trying to figure out how we help them solve that problem of getting from where they are to where they're trying to go. They got to get off of those legacy systems. And how do we do that? You can do that with Zoom.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that organizations are trying to crack that nut. What are the best ways to evaluate where they are and what they have to know how to build that plan to get to what the end state they?
Yeah, I think the end state ideally for the government seems to be, especially for Department of War and specifically Navy and Marine Corps, is really how do you get to a hybrid cloud, and what technology enables that? And so I think what you're trying to leverage is existing investments that you already have without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I've got to take what I have, figure out how to innovate it. And as you move through that path, we can figure out a way to give you that true hybrid technology while integrating with the existing systems. Microsoft Teams is obviously out there. It's a big player. We can integrate with Microsoft Teams. We can integrate with existing CRM systems. We can integrate across all the different platforms. So your protection, investment protection is there, but we can also work through that innovation path with you.
Yeah, so it sounds like a wise way to approach it, because the Navy has been pretty outspoken about how proud it is of flank speed and what it accomplished through flank speed. And it's not going anywhere anytime soon.
Exactly.
But at the same time, the needs that the service has 5 years from now, 10 years from now, will probably be completely different than what it needs today, or what it needs when it needed when it conceived flank speed.
Absolutely. I think that's always the challenge in Department of War and government in general, federal agencies. The budgeting cycles, what you're spending today was budgeted 4 or 5 years ago. And I think trying to get ahead of that curve, and you're trying to see over that horizon, just making those small incremental investments. You can't jump from 1985 to 2026 and do that without making that incremental step. And I think trying to time that incremental step and not make it so investment heavy, you can see over that horizon without having to be at the tip of the spear and make a bad decision that potentially could be detrimental in the long term. You don't want to engineer yourself into a corner.
You mentioned, you made a comment at the beginning that I think is interesting. You talked about not investing too much in that middle ground between where you are today and where you ultimately want to go. How do you determine what the balance is on what you want to spend in the middle? Because you need to do something. You need to continue to improve and iterate, but without going overboard and locking yourself into something that's not going to help you long term.
Well, I think the government's doing it now. I think that they're consolidating their buying power, right? So they're bringing everything to the enterprise level. They're leveraging the fact that they're going to be buying at an enterprise speed and scale, which sometimes is that's a double-edged sword because they don't move quickly. But I think as you look around kind of how they're doing that consolidation, they're reducing their IT sprawl. So by reducing the IT sprawl, leveraging their buying power and bringing everything to an enterprise solution, you don't have those sort of shadow IT elements that are out there, and you can continue to innovate from there. It's really hard to innovate when not everyone's rowing the same direction.
Yeah, shadow IT is a term I haven't heard for a while. That's probably a good thing, because well, maybe not. Maybe it means people are getting better at hiding it than they used to be. But is that an issue that becomes less and less necessary as organizations get a better enterprise view of what's going on?
I think it does and it doesn't. I think it kind of depends on whether or not you have a PACE plan or some sort of alternative path. If your primary option is down or it's not available, where do I go? I think at the same time, Marine Corps and Navy presents a unique tactical challenge when it comes to how do you got a lot of disparate systems that are out there. They're on ships. They're in really bandwidth challenged areas, and trying to get good communications and reliable communications to that level is really hard. So.
Colonel Craig Clarkson's commanding officer for Marine Corps Tactical Systems Support Activity at Marine Corps Systems Command. Colonel Kevin Stepp is Assistant Chief of Staff G6 at 1MEF. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. Colonel Clarkson, I start with you. What does force design look like at this point in time from your seat?
So force design broadly is the Marine Corps' effort to modernize for future conflict. From my seat, being at MCTISA, we're primarily focused on command control, cyber communications, intelligence, reconnaissance, surveillance, targeting, and autonomous platforms. So MCTISA is a DoD lab, work in the C5I space, and we've been working primarily in our space to separate hardware from software, moving towards smaller form factor systems to enable Marines at the edge, enhancing the capabilities that they have, both with a small form factor hardware and also the software solutions that we provide.
Colonel Stepp, what about 1MEF?
Since force design was issued by the service, there have been a series of successive updates. And the most recent update this past October stated we're in the implementation phase. And the focus of that implementation is really taking the work that Colonel Clarkson and his team is doing, primarily focused on C2 and fires implementation, and making it reality, putting it online, validating the systems. And we're discovering that the link between C2 and fires is inextricable, meaning that I spend a lot more time as a C4 planner working with our fires team than I do with really any other staff section, which is a really exciting time for the Marine Corps and the work we're getting after.
What it sounds like to me is really important too, is that the concept of force design and the business lines under it are being embedded into the way that the Marine Corps does business. It's not an initiative anymore, the way I think a lot of people perceived it to be when it first came down. Is that a fair observation on my part?
I think so, yeah. I mean, there's certainly some investment decisions the Marine Corps was making initially about where we want to put our money for systems in the future based on how we wanted to refactor, the service. But I think that what's really happened with the Force Done initiative broadly is driving this tighter partnership between end users and the supporting establishment, the people actually using the gear and the people that are delivering the gear, and trying to turn cycles a little bit faster, ideally bringing industry partners in to work with us so we get best of breed. And so as we are looking at, from an acquisition standpoint, you have the big R requirement of the capability broadly that we want to deliver. Just getting that paperwork and handing that off to a program office is not enough. You need to actually be engaging directly with end users to understand their use cases. So yes, we have a requirement for this capability. And yes, what that means in practice is Marines need the ability to do, whatever it might be. And so by having Marines from 1MEF or other MEFs working with folks from the supporting establishment at organizations like MCTISA, we're able to partner with those Marines, provide them the latest in the capability that we're trying to deliver, get iterative feedback from them, and then provide that information back to program offices so that when we find a solution that works and they go to scale, we know that we got it right. Vice a big bang solution 5 years after the program office got the requirement, we want to iterate to get there and make sure we deliver the right capability at the right time.
Colonel Stepp, what are you doing at 1MEF to do, as Colonel Clarkson alluded to get that tighter collaboration between the end user and the person that's getting the gear for that end user?
I think what we're getting after, Francis, is no longer are we doing the exquisite installation of C2 systems for a temporal exercise. We're using exercises to validate, to put runs on the board, and then we're keeping the systems online. Right now on Camp Pendleton, we've got an operations center that we man 24/7. And that's a means to provide a platform to integrate these systems, but to keep them online and to mature the capability, not only mature the tech, but mature the associated staff process with how we do some of these exquisite high-end technologies and implementing them for the sake of the forces forward.
I read that one of the ways that you're trying to get after the Pentagon's guidance on commercial solutions is something called Project Dynamis. What's Project Dynamis, and how are you moving out on that?
Sure. So Project Dynamis is an effort inside the Marine Corps to accelerate delivery of some of these C5I capabilities that we so desperately need to modernize. What we're trying to do is build on the momentum of a number of exercises and experiments that have been done in the past or last several years under the auspices of like the department's larger combined joint all domain command and control efforts. And in that, you've got separate efforts among each service. And that, what we're trying to do with Project Dynamis is, again, like we discussed, partnering with end users, understanding what they need, bringing in the latest capabilities that are available from industry, really partnering with industry in a more direct and meaningful way, and then also continue to be involved in some of these joint experimentation and really just, I wouldn't even say experimentation, but like proof of concept efforts, like one we did recently with the Army 4th Infantry Division at IV Sting at Fort Carson, Colorado. So it's, we want to, again, have end users partner with the capability developers, acquisition professionals, partner with industry engineers to iterate in real time, make adjustments, and then keep moving. And I think we're having a lot of success. And what I see happening across the department is all the services kind of converging on the same roadmap of where they want to go. And hopefully we're going to be really successful at the end, making it a lot easier for the operators to be able to connect all the sensors with all the shooters and make decisions at machine speed based on some of the artificial intelligence technologies we're procuring.
Colonel Sepp, we have, go ahead.
Yeah, one of the exciting activities happening right now has really been an effort architected by the Project Dynamis team at the service headquarters. And this is a series of Dynamis serials. We're currently executed what Colonel Clarkson spoke to was Dynamis serial 003 at Ivy Sting. What we're doing is taking the hardware and software we have now, and we are moving data. We're moving across multiple enclaves. We're closing gaps between C2 and fire systems and bringing tremendous capability. And what Dynamis has helped us do is put a mark on the wall or a mark on the calendar in a time compressed manner to deliver capability right now. It's a very exciting time.
Bill Roberts is Field Chief Technology Officer for Federal Services for Riverbed. It's great to see you, Bill. Before we turn the cameras on, you were talking about the fact that you consider yourself on a soapbox, still having to tell government people about the importance of trusting data to make decisions 10 or 15 years into the data-based decision-making process. Yeah. Why do you think that's still the case?
So I think it's a mind shift that still needs to occur, that the truth is there, it's in the data, and if you are collecting the right data, a perfect example is the Navy's world-class alignment metrics, right? They went through a very long process of tying what they are collecting to their mission objectives, right? And because of that, they now know that this is what they need to measure. And because they're measuring that and it flows up and goes into one of those top 5 mission objectives, that is what they need to focus on. And they need to trust that data and they need to move forward with it. And they've made huge strides by doing that, right? And I think part of it comes from a belief that we know ourselves better than anything that's measuring us does. And I think that sometimes those preconceived notions need to be challenged a little bit.
When somebody comes to you and about that model that you just described and says, I want that, what do they usually not have that prevents them from getting to that? Or what steps do they usually need to take to get to that?
So the number one challenge that most of them have is upper level support, right? The reason why Navy was successful with world-class alignment metrics was that Admiral Small was 100% behind it and drove it through, right? So if you don't have that top level support for it, you're not going to be able to implement the mind shift in all of the divisions or organizations within that to support that as an overarching framework. So number one, you've got to have top level support for it. And then number two, you've got to do the work of first deciding what are those top level things that are most important, and get agreement on that first. And once you've gotten that, which is no small effort in of itself, then the whole mapping exercise of understanding what are the metrics, what are the consolidated metrics that support each one of those top level things, that is the process to follow. Once you have that map, once you've got that framework built, then you can start to worry about, how do I get the tooling? How do I get the right instrumentation? How do I get the right consolidation of that data and interpretation of that and visualization of that data? And I think part of the challenge is people want to jump to the answer, and they want to go find that new BI tool, that new visualization tool that's going to solve all their problems without having had that framework built first, without having that alignment between what you're measuring it and why you're measuring it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and it sounds like the conundrum that these organizations have been in for the 20 years that I've been following them, probably a long time before that, which is there are solutions that are cool and interesting.
Yeah.
And the fundamentals are not nearly as cool and interesting, but are a lot more important, it sounds like.
Right.
Is that a fair read on
I think it is. I think it is. I think also, it's not just the cool and interesting, it's the belief that there is magic out there.
Uh-huh.
And if we just all stir it all together, that the magic is going to come out and it's going to make sense out of this data that we've been trying to work with for so long.
Yeah.
Right. But if the framework is there, if that alignment isn't there first, it really doesn't matter what tooling. And this is coming from a guy who works for a company that makes telemetry tools, right? So I think that you've got to have the understanding first before you go try to measure it, before you start trying to collect it and visualize it. If you don't have that alignment, you'll never get there.
So want to talk about fundamentals from maybe a different angle.
Sure.
Regarding data fundamentals, data quality, data alignment. Are you seeing that improving across the various components of the building that you're working with?
I do. I see that there is an understanding, and it's a slow burgeoning understanding, that sampling is only just so effective, that you need to look at full fidelity data, and that you need to have a way to take that full fidelity data, this massive amount of data, and you need to reduce the noise out of it, right? And so being able to apply anomaly engines that are looking at that large mass amount of data and events and alerts that are coming up, and reduce that down into what's important for you, the automation and the AI that can do that for you, trusting that process, I think, is kind of the next evolution, right? That, sampling only does so much for you, because you're going to miss some very important things if you are going for that sampling approach. But the other challenge is, if you go full fidelity, how do you have the ability to process all of that, right?
Thanks for watching Innovation in Government from WEST 2026, presented by Carahsoft. We also thank leaders from the Navy, Marine Corps, and industry who shared their insights on this program. You can find more Innovation in Government programs at fedgovtoday.com. I'm Francis Rose. Thanks again for watching.